Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on the bottom of page 1359. 1359. And we are learning, I've been learning about Malchus. As I said, this is based on Biyuri HaZeyar, the one he cited above, closer to the top of the page. He said, Biyuri HaZeyar Pasha Bolok. So there, a lot of these ideas are discussed there. I actually look there because actually can help understand some of it, even though it's quite complicated there. But briefly, what we've learned is that Malchus lesla magama klum. It doesn't have anything of its own, and we learned that there are two meanings in that. It only has what it receives from Zah, from the Mashpia, or what it receives from below through Avodah, what he called the Avodah of Neshamis and Malachim. That's what is stated on page 1357. And that's all about understanding the Eir HaMakabel, which we're going to get back to, Mashpia Makabel, which I'll talk about in a moment. Okay. To understand that, he spoke about how Malchus emanates as a Nekuda Achas, is the only sphere whose root at its origins just comes as a point. And later, it's built up. The 9 spheres are built up, as I said, either from Zah, from the Mashpia, or from through Avodah, which we'll get back to later. So he's now analyzing what is this Nekuda like? What is this point of Malchus like? And as I discussed at length in previous classes, because Malchus lies at the crux, at the heart of everything that we do. The Avodah of Binyan Malchus, of building it, because Malchus is the Mamutza, is the last of the 10 spheres that ultimately will create the world of, through it will become the creation of Biyah. So Malchus becomes, when we say Malchus, that Knesset Yisrael, for example, the Jewish people are compared to Malchus. Melochim Heim, Bnei Melochim Heim. So Malchus is both the place where the diminishment of the moon happens, but also the birth and the growth. Or to use the other words, that Malchus gives birth. That's the Nekeva that gives birth. So everything, Malchus flows the whole Avodah of a person. So the building of Malchus. So the Nekuda, he said, even though on one hand it's just a point, it doesn't have Giluyim like Zah emanated with 6 facets. So Malchus is just a Nekuda, but that Nekuda, explained on page 1358, is rooted in Atzmus. In Atzmus sense of that which is higher than Gili. That Nekuda, the Nekuda of Malchus. So that's why, even though on one hand Malchus is a very diminished state, and Nekuda is concealment, Shcheirani, I am dark, but Venava, and beautiful. Because it also carries within it the highest levels that are higher than all the revelations, all the way to the Helam Ha'atzmi that we learned about earlier. Okay. So that's like the Merchav Ha'atzmi connects all the way to the expansion. Min ha'meitzer karasi ka anani ba'merchav ka. The next paragraph, which began at the bottom of page 1358, to sum up, he said, now it's certain that even though Malchus is a state of concealment and it's rooted in the highest levels of concealment, meaning higher than revelation, but there's also Oir. There's a Oir and a Keli. However, the Oir there is only for its own needs, because Malchus is not in a state of Mashpia yet. At this point, it's only receiving, like a newborn child that's nursing. It has only for its own needs. Zah is more developed already as a Mashpia, but Malchus is fundamentally on its own just a Makabel. So it has Oir, but it's only l'sheirach atzma. Or like a Seichel, when you start learning something, you can't yet explain it to others. It's only there, the minimum time for you to understand it. Okay. And then the Va'oid Zeis, he said, and there's an additional point, and also from Biyuri HaZeyar, that I did the Torah lemivla leipolit. That Malchus is in a state of absorbing, and when you're busy absorbing, you don't exude. So Malchus is the epitome of absorption. Zah has both elements. The Gimel Rishenish of Zah, even when they're in a state of diminished state, Moichen de Katnus, they do have a connection to some form of absorbing. But Zah, the Zayin Tachtenis, the main part of Zah is Mashpia. Even if it's a younger form of Hashpah, it's said even a cotton, but there's some form of Hashpah, Mashpia. Whereas Malchus is purely, I did the Lemivla, it's only the busy of absorbing. And on the contrary, the last thing we learned was when it's absorbing, it's in a state of aliyah and iskaulos. Not only is it not transmitting, it's going the other direction. It's going upward like a flame without its container, without its wick. It is completely consumed with and becomes absorbed by reaching upward. And that's the Nekudas HaMalchus, which is called Keser, the Rotzen within it. It's natural Rotzen, like you said, from the word Merutza, to be drawn into its source. So that's why it's like a Nekuda. It's dark because it doesn't have anything of its own. Its whole focus, Malchus, is higher being, its entire being is about being absorbed in its source. That's where we stopped, 3 lines from the bottom of page 1359. And again, keep in mind, this is Malchus on its own, the way it was emanated. We're not talking now the Tosfos, Tosfos, where Malchus receives the 9 spheres, because Malchus is definitely going to be a full-blown entity. But we're talking about it at its root. That's what it's like. Like he said even earlier, that even when the moon was created, and the moon was a full-blown luminary, Shnei Me'eres Hagdelim. But he said on page 1355 that even before the diminishment of the moon, it was still in a state of Makabel, which means that the light it had came through Zah. Even though it was shining fully, but essentially it's a receptacle in the sense of a recipient. Not because it's weak, because that's its state that God created. There's a mashpia, there's a makabel. Basically, that we have within us 2 elements. There's a part of us that is supposed to transmit. There's a part of us that's supposed to absorb. And the absorbing part is rooted all the way in the highest levels of the Nekuda, like you said. Okay, so now we're going to continue on, where he's going to continue again, going back to the point of the previous parentheses, in the difference between Zah and Malchus. So let's continue reading 3 lines from the bottom of page 1359. It's a parentheses that goes, it's a little shorter one, but it also goes around 9 lines. Okay, so now, and you'll nothing here, what he's saying now is somewhat continuing what he said in the previous parentheses, that Zah has both elements. It receives, its higher levels receive, and its lower levels mashpia. Whereas Malchus is on its own is only an absorber, a recipient. So he says, V'zeu gamkein, the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. He says, V'zeu gamkein, sheyesh hefers ben Zah Malchus. This that we just said, and the additional point that Malchus is in a state of aliyah and istalkus. Aliyah means elevating, and istalkus means expiring. Like, in other words, it's not the opposite of islapshus and amshacha. It's not amshacha v'shai. He says this is also that there's the difference between zeu gamkein sheyesh hefers ben Zah Malchus. This is also part of what we're talking about, the difference between Zah and Malchus. The Zah, even though Zah, like we said in the previous parentheses, Cholas are in a state of being attached and cleaving to their source. Remember, the spheres are God's attributes. So even Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod are also in a state of dveikus of ha'olol, of the effect, be'ilose, in its cause. So the effect is, ilav ha'olol means cause and effect. So the dveikus of the effect is connecting and attaching to the cause, which is affecting it. Ubebchines aliyah. So even Zah is also in a state of aliyah. Nevertheless, Mekol Mokim, liyeshe b'chines vav k'sovis, being that it emanated as a full-bodied six-faceted entity, not as just an akuda, a dark point, a concealed point. How do you nechaz b'zayin tachtenus? So even though it has an element that it's connected to its source, but it's also nechaz, it's defined by and contained by. Nechaz also means, we spoke achiza. It's grasped by. So it engages with. The Zayin Tachtenis are the 7 lower levels of the Zah, not just the Gimel Rishenis, which is more connected to the mind of the emotions. The mind of the emotions are receiving from above. That's the bittul to their source. But Midas have a function, the functionality of the emotions in the Zayin Tachtenis. So though they have the element of bittul and aliyah, that Zah we're talking about, nevertheless, it's in a state also of a hashpah. Like we discussed, it's a mashpia that has bittul to his source, but it's also in a state of transmission. If Zah would not transmit, then it would not be doing its function. So to use the sun and the moon as example, the sun only has light because God gave it light. So you could imagine the sun has bittul to the creator of the luminary, but the sun's role is not to be in a state of bittul and a state of absorbing. The sun's role, its bittul, is to give. It would be like someone who says, I want to sit and listen to the Rebbe all day. I want to go to my teacher. No, your mission, your job, you are created in order to give, to exude. So though Zah has bittul and aliyah, but because that's why it was created with 6 facets to be a mashpia. Malchus was created, we're talking about again, its core creation, its root. It's to be an absorber. That's all it does. Here, it's also and he's saying even more than that. Not only is the 7 emotions, the 7 lower levels being mashpia, but it's also drawing from the Gimel Rishein is the moichin, like he said before, that are connected to higher. That's Zah. Avl HaMalchus. So let me just elaborate a bit more on that, which means that Zah, when it's being mashpia, even though the primary hashpah is coming from the Zayin Tachtenis, from the emotional side of it, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, etc., but it's also drawing from the moichin that's informing it. It's in a diminished form because it's coming through Midas, it's Zah, but it's also part of the hashpah, even though there's that element of bittul. Avl HaMalchus. But Malchus, by contrast, being that it emanated just as a dark, as a concealed point, 1 point, not 6 facets. Next page, 1360. Just 1 point. This is the root nekuda, the nekuda hashroshis, that root seed, so to speak. That emanated, that was emanated from the Ein Sof, the infinite divine Maitzel, the emanator. Ein lo dover hanechaz. It doesn't have anything to hold on to because it's just a nekuda. It's a point. The 6 facets of Zah are an entity with 6 dimensions. Here there are no dimensions. In a nekuda, there's no dimensions. So it has nothing. There's no dover hanechaz. V'ibchinas aliyah v'iskalus. So like he said before with the flame, it doesn't have a wick to hold on to, a keli here to hold on to. So what is the main focus there? Is aliyah v'iskalus, to elevate and be encompassed in its source. Zah, God created with an entity with 6 facets to manifest in, and therefore through which it will channel and transmit. And Malchus is in a state of his aliyah v'iskalus. So he's continuing, as I said, the difference between Zah and Malchus. Let me stop for a moment if anybody wants to clarify anything, any questions. Okay. V'yesh leimer, let's continue. V'yesh leimer, the Mishum Zeh.
Of the Malchus. Yeah. What is the purpose? It should be such a bittul.
I thought that's what we're discussing. I mean, the purpose is that we should learn from this how not to process and only absorb. and have the concept of bittul. That to me is a good enough reason just there. On a deeper level, it's about this concept that Malchus has a role. There's a concept of being a makabel, a makabel. Why did God create the moon? Why didn't he just create a sun? What do we need a moon for? So there's two different forces. God created the cholte lahayir, the cholte shaloi lahayir. There's the power to emanate and flow and transmit, and there's the power to conceal and to not radiate. And it's more in a state of, like in this case, we're talking absorbing, receiving.
Seems to me that it's true what you're saying, but the main purpose is that this is the only tool for so-called the Helam Atzmi to be nisgalo b'tachtenim, because there is no self entity here. I'm correct?
You could say that, yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we're going to learn about it more. He didn't finish the subject, but it's all part of it, yeah. As a matter of fact, you remind me now, when we learned about the two differences between Mashpia and Makabel, on page 1355 and 1357, sorry, he spoke about two differences. One is that Mashpia is revelation, Gilui, and Makabel is Helam. The second difference is the Mashpia is Atzmi V'Tivi, and doesn't need an additional element to make it into Mashpia, and Makabel does. And extension of that, there was another point that the Mashpia is Mashpia, what he has from within himself, and B'koyach Atzmi, and also with his own power, where a Makabel is not being Mashpia what he has, it's Mashpia what he's receiving, and with the power from outside of himself. So you could say, based on that, that now when we're speaking about the Nakuda of Malchus, in both elements, it's both concealment as opposed to revelation, and also that it is not giving its own, it's always aware of that which is higher than it. So in some way, you could say that is a manifestation of the Helam Atzmi as well, but also including what you just said, which is that it does reveal to us a level of the divine that is beyond revelation. Like we learned earlier at length, that's what the Kalim reveal, and that's what the mitzvahs, that they come down to Kalim, the Shimu, which is higher than Oyer, yeah, like what the Baal Tshuva achieves, yeah. So it's correct, you could say that, yeah.
So also has a source for whatever he has too. It's from the Eibishter also.
Yeah, but Zah's main focus or function is hashpah, is to transmit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's his qualifying. He says Zah also has an element of absorbing, but it's also in a state of transmitting. And in Malchus, you don't have the transmitting part on its own.
Oh, because you were talking the word
Only
like intrinsic.
absorbing.
You were talking about intrinsic. That's why I was saying that. You know, they're both.
Well, Zah also has intrinsic bittul, but it also has intrinsic hashpah. Or maybe you could say even more than that, that maybe the main thing is it's intrinsic to is transmission. Even more than that, because he said Gimel Shenis. Let me just see something. Yeah, I would correct and say Zah, what's intrinsic to Zah is the 6 facets, and being a recipient is actually, he called that he called that the Gimel Shenis is the recipient. That's interesting. Because on page 1357, he did say that the Gimel Shenish in Zah is B'sei Tesvis. And he explained 2 ways, Moichin that come from Ishtalshlus, and Moichin Chadoshim through Avodah. Let me just see, I'm just looking a second. There's a few ways to understand that. Okay. Yeah, good.
You would think that the last part, what you just said, because it says 6 aspects, that Zohar has 6 aspects,
6 facets, yeah.
facets, right? But really, if it's intrinsically, if the 3 Gimel Rishonos are intrinsic there instead of Tosefet, Tosfot, then it would be 9 or 10, right? I mean, you would think they would have to.
So he said clearly
that
that's why I said he does not say the Gimel Rishonos are not intrinsic. That's added on.
Right. Okay. So that's right. So then it would be only 7. But why wouldn't it be 7? Because you have Malchus is also intrinsically in Zah. Each Tiferes has Malchus in it. Why wouldn't it be 7 facets?
Zah is 6, not 7. Zah is Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod. That's the 6 facets. Malchus,
But it also has.
That's so what Malchus that's encompassed within it, but the fundamental structure of Zah is 6 spheres, and Malchus is the Nakuda. This is the in this case we're not talking about 7, we're talking about 6.
But I'm just trying to understand if Tiferes, when it was created in Atzilus, it has Malchus in it. So wouldn't it say
but the Zah consists of 6 midas that can have 7 within them, but the fundamental structure is 6.
Right. Right, I understand, son, but each one of them has 7. Could you say that? Okay.
That's not a problem. Yeah, he said that. Yeah.
So Tiferes has 7 facets.
Not 7 facets, 7 spheres within it. 6 both tzavos. I wouldn't call them facets. I'd call them spheres.
I see. Okay.
Rabbi Jacobson, is it fair to say to his point that
Chachma also has all 9 within it?
Rabbi Jacobson, is it fair to say that the Malchut part of, let's say, Tiferet is the point that obviously the Zohar has to receive in order to give? Is the Malchut within each of the emotional Sefirot the part that receives in order for the Zohar to give?
No,
is that what you say?
No. It's the Gimel Rishonos that receive. He said explicitly on the end of the parentheses on 1359 that the Malchus within each of the Zayin with the Malchus, he said, is the Hashpah who mebchinas HaMalchus sheba'asfiris. He actually said the exact opposite. The Malchus within this in Zah is the source of Hashpah, but that's not Malchus in its pure form. That's Malchus within Zah. Read the last line, the parentheses on page 1359.
Thank you.
Yeah. What I was wondering is the Gimel Rishonos, she clearly said, are the say Tesvis, and he said there's 2 levels in that. The Meicha that come beside the Shtalshus would be naturally, they grow into the person, and there's the Meicha that comes Chadoshim through Avodah. Okay. So let's continue on here. So he says like this, V'yesh leimer, and we can say the Mishum Zeh, that due to this, there's difference between Zah and Malchus. That Malchus is a Nekuda, and therefore doesn't have any substance upon which to grasp it. Mishum Zeh yesh hefresh gam be'etzem ha'aliyah. So now he's going to explain there's also a difference in how the aliyah is. Even though Zah also has aliyah, we just explained it also connects to its source. But it's also mashpia. So he says there's also a difference between Malchus and Zah in the aliyah part. For who? And what's that difference? So till now we were learning the difference is that Malchus doesn't have hashpah, transmission, only absorption. Zah has absorption and transmission. But now he's saying even their absorption, even their aliyah is different. V'hu the bizarre mashatev ha'olol lihidovek, the nature of an olol. When it's one thing, when there's cause and effect, and the effect is drawn to its cause, which is a concept in Chkira and Kabbalah, Chassidus, that anything that's cause and effect, the effect wants to return to and is drawn back to its source. Is that concept? It says when it's drawn back to the Dovek, hu mashanim shechel mekere. There, Zoh is being drawn back to its source. It wants to go back to its source because it came from somewhere. Like you say, zreik chuter lavira ikr koi. Then when you throw a stick up in the air, it will go back on the ikr, will fall back on its main place, on its main core. The ikr ha'mavukash bezeh, and the primary objective here, what is the objective of Zoh? What is Zoh seeking? Who lekabel mimkede is to receive from its source. And here's the distinction. Mashenke in Malchus, he says he b'chinas hiskalelus b'mkede. Malchus is to be encompassed in its source. In other words, Zoh is an entity. As an entity, it recognizes the value of connecting to its source, which is like its teacher, and it wants to receive from there. Malchus never sees itself as an entity because it never came in its original, in its origins, in its root. It only is a nekudah. It's utter bittul. So there, being that it has nothing of substance, it's about being encompassed in the source, which is different than being drawn to the source in order to receive from it. Because there, it's an entity that wants to connect. So there's more consciousness in Zoh, basically, so to speak. That's what I think he's saying. V'zehu, the ikar inyan Rotzo b'chinas Malchus. That's why we say that the primary yearning and the primary seeking and longing is in Malchus, more than any other sphere. Why is Eretz, which is Malchus, called Eretz? It comes from the word Sherotzasa, Lasses at St. Cain, Sherotzasa. Again, word Rotzasa means like running toward, being driven toward. Ukamoy Lamaya Zamrecha, Nuhura Tata, Kare Tade Lenuhura Ilah. So the Chazal say in Laman Zamrecha that what? That it sings in order, because Nuhura Tata, the lower light, is calling to the higher one. Sometimes the expression is Mayim Tachtenim Boichin Lamayim Elyenim. So there's an inner longing from the lower entity to reach to the higher entity. And elsewhere it's explained that this is due to the distance and to the deficiency of the oir. So it wants to, and is longing to be encompassed in its source. Okay. So obviously this needs explanation. But he definitely added now a whole new dimension into the difference between the bittul of Zoh and the bittul of Malchus. And a very balbatish, practical way you can say the difference is where we learned about two types of bittul, heder tfisas mokim, and there's a bittul where you completely don't exist. Like, for example, you can have a great teacher who, in the presence of his teacher, when his teacher shows up, he's completely nullified and doesn't say anything. But that's not because he doesn't exist. That's because he recognizes his great teacher, and therefore he has bittul to him. But when the teacher is not there, he's a full shining light of his own. Think of a candle in the light of the sun. So in the light of the sun, the candle doesn't have any value. But you can't say it has no inherent value. Take away the sun, the candle has a lot of power. It can illuminate a dark room. But compared to the sun, it's shraga betira mayahan. Then there's a level that even when it's on its own, it doesn't have any value. That the bittul is so deep that it's not just when I'm in face of my teacher. So you could say Zoh is an entity that was created in order to be mashpia, but it's a healthy mashpia that recognizes it has a teacher, it has a source, and it wants to connect to that source. That's the aliyah of Zoh. The nature of it is to be drawn. It wants to reconnect with to where it received, but in order to receive from it. In Malchus, there's just an inherent element of bittul that it's about like a flame that wants to be encompassed in its mother flame, not because it's receiving something from it, but because that's its natural state is bittul, and bittul is to be encompassed in its source. Now, what his adding at the end seems to be that Zoh does not sense inadequacy. Zoh senses that I can be greater if I go to my teacher. I'll have more wisdom. So Zoh is drawn to his teacher. In Malchus senses a distance. Remember, we learned the difference between the tzaddik and the Baal Tshuva, that the tzaddik too feels that he wants to connect, but it's not because he's feeling a deep hunger or thirst, because the tzaddik is connected already. The tzamel chanafshi that we talked about, almost a desperate call, a call like a deathly distress call, is only when you feel real distance. And Malchus senses the distance. And as such, so there's I think 2 points here. One that is inherent bittul, but also that it senses a distance and therefore wants to be encompassed in the source, not because it wants more shlemus, because it wants to connect to the source, but because it wants to be completely encompassed within it. So I think there's a few points here. It's being very brief and a little dense. So I'm trying to unpack it a bit. But I think those are the points that he's making here. In this parentheses, in this second half of the parentheses. But let me stop if anybody wants to discuss or clarify any points here.
Rabbi Jacobson, is this like basically the explanation of Emunah? Because like that's the level of Malchut that it yearns, but really doesn't have a solid source to like Zoh does. Is that fair to say?
I don't know. I'm not sure. He doesn't use the word Amunah here at all, so I don't know. To me, if you add that, it may complicate matters. I'm not sure if this is called Amunah.
What is the Nehoirot HaTorah? Kori Tadir the Nehoirot law. The Malchus is the Nehoirot HaTorah?
Yeah. Yeah. We learned about it earlier when he talked about Hatzemeah. Trying to remember where it was.
Is Malchus is bittul so much that it doesn't even recognize its own existence? I mean, it go that far?
I would say it doesn't have an existence in the first place. That's what it sounds like.
Well, something wants to go up and something wants to be engulfed and something wants to merge.
Yeah, I understand, because it is an akuda, but it's not, let's put it this way. It embodies the archetype of bittul, of utter bittul. And, but it did emanate as an akuda. It's not like there's nothing there. It's just, its emanation is one that doesn't have any substance. It would be like someone that's in a perpetual state of being a student, period, which is constantly dependent on a teacher. It may be helpful. I don't know if maybe I should teach the Biyudei Hazeh. The Biyudei Hazeh is very complex. but I'll look at it again. I'm just. Look, at this point, I would stay away from trying to discuss it in Avodah so much, and just more discussing the very level of what we're discussing here. Even though it's hard to avoid, because he is using words like Rotzo and Tadir. You know, he is using words of Avodah, like it's calling, it's seeking, it's longing. But to me, I think what I would think is that he's describing the entity of Malchus. What Malchus is like an archetype of this state of bittul. That's what it looks like he's saying. Anyway, there's going to be more to be said on all this. I would continue reading and learning, and we're going to go back until we get this right. So let me read on. He says,
This is like you said, that there is a Talmud that himself is a big person, but he's bottled to his love, but he's having his entity. Malchus is like a Talmud that is nothing in his eyes, not that he feels something about himself. That's the idea.
Yeah, like in a way, Zoh is an entity, so wants more shlemus. Malchus is not looking for shlemus. Malchus is looking for connection, so to speak. So Zoh wants to receive from its source because it understands the value of it. It's like I spoke yesterday about the tefillah la'oni. When the pauper is standing before the king, it's not because he appreciates the king that he's drawn to him. It's because he's in such a state of lowliness that is completely receptive and open to the king himself. In a way, it's almost like a naive state. I don't say the word naive, but it's due to his lack of appreciation. It's the chacham that is drawn to the king because he appreciates what the king is. So the bittul of the ani, of the Malchus, is much deeper, even though Zoh is also drawn. That's what I think. So Zoh is drawn to the shlemus of it, like, it's getting more from the mocker. Like a wise person wants to go to his teacher to get more wisdom. Malchus is not a wise person. Malchus is feeling, either it's feeling nothingness or it's feeling a distance, if anything.
Yeah, we're missing.
This is what he said 2 lines ago, that the Zoh nimshach el mekoiroi, ikar mevukosh lekabel mekoiroi,
Right.
Malchus is a skalalus mekoiroi.
Exactly. It's almost like saying the difference between a newborn child that just wants to be embraced by its mother, or an older child that wants to receive from its mother and its parent, because it appreciates that. Very different. That actually may be a good example, because he did speak earlier about a child.
How about the difference in the two Hasidic approaches? One to a tzaddik. One is that we receive in order, but it's a koach atzmo, we're supposed to develop, and one is, what's that phrase of tzaddik b'chaye?
I'll take you yeah.
That he's going to just certain Hasidic groups that just hold on to the tzaddik, the Rebbe, and he's going to pull you through. Yet it's not your own kind of kochos that are being called upon or to develop so much. More just hold on to
that. It could be used, but there, we usually see it as a mila that we do use our own kochos. Here, looks like Malchus is a deeper level of bittul. I think in Avodah, Malchus is ultimately a sense of that you don't feel you have anything of your own, and therefore you want to be completely encompassed in the source. Zoh knows it has on its own, but it wants to connect to the source because it appreciates it and values it and is drawn to it. That would be, in simple words, I think, the difference, because that's why it's also the words Malchus les lo megamo klum. You don't say that on Zoh. Even the level of Zoh that wants to be absorbed and is longing to connect its source, you don't say it have nothing on its own. Malchus, that phrase is used. And I really believe this is going to be clearer and clearer as we go. So I wouldn't be concerned if you don't get it yet. I don't get it also completely yet. Let's see how he further explains it.
You said it right. With Malchus, you reach the core, more than so.
But precisely because you have no Giluyim in the way, so to speak.
Because your goal is not you. In Zohar, you want the kabel nemekoiro. You want to grow. In Malchus, it's not you.
Look, the difference between Oyer and Keli in a way, Oyer or Gilui and Helam. In Oyer is Dovuk Lemoyer. Oyer wants to connect to its source because it appreciates its source. The Helam wants to connect to the source not because it appreciates it, because it senses its lack of anything of its own. Yeah. V'nimtza. Let's read the next line. V'nimtza. So we derive from this, we draw from this, the b'chinas nekudas ha-malchus, that this nekuda of malchus, this point, ima yesef b'chinas er v'keli, eina b'chinas hashpah. Even though it's a level of er and keli, but it's not in a form of transmission. The er part we learned because the er is only for itself, and the keli is so negligible that it's not enough to contain it and draw it down. That's how I would explain, because he said before, she'ein lo b'chinas kelim, but he meant she'ein lo b'chinas lias nechas behem. So in the beginning of the last paragraph, in bottom of 1358, he said, Zois vadei, that Mekudas HaMalchus has oir because it's netzel like a oir and a keli. But the oir and keli of Malchus is very different than the oiris and kelim of Zoh, in the sense that the oir is only for its own needs, and everything else is all about, it's not about hashpah at all. It's not about transmission. Not from the oir level, not the keli level. That's very clear here. Okay, good. So it's not hashpah. It's interesting because in the Torah Shalom, if you remember, we spoke about the Koyach Hariyah, Makabel, Mashpia. So the Rebbe Rashab says, Simchas Torah Samach Zayin, the Bochrim were at the time rebelling and refusing to accept. They said, let's learn on our own. We don't need our Mashpim. And the Rebbe Rashab went a whole talk he gave them that you need to be a Makabel. There's a thing of being a Makabel. You can't be a Mashpia until you're first a real Makabel. But not because it's a preparatory stage. Okay, you know what? I'll train for 2 years or whatever amount of time to receive, and now I can be a giver. You have to really be in a full state of bittul of a makabel. And only after that can you become a mashpia. So it very much, when I think about that sichi, there, the application is much easier to understand. Because in other words, right now, you're standing before your teacher, you're in the student stage, or like we were chayzrim, your job is not to explain. Your job is not to be mashpia. Your job is to absorb. Be a dry sponge. That's all that's necessary here. A completely dry sponge. All you are here is to absorb your source. You're not here a chacham. You're not Zah that has 6 facets, a personality, and you appreciate your teacher and therefore you want to hear more from him. No, you should be an empty container, a clay rekon, an empty container like a dry sponge, and all your job is to absorb. That's essentially what he said to the Bochrim then. I'm paraphrasing it a bit and explaining it. So the key here is that's not hashpah. Are you getting oir? There's oir in you? Yes, but the oir is for you to absorb the oir. It's not for you to give. It's not, you shouldn't be focusing now, how am I going to explain it to myself or to others or to my students one day, etc. That's the key thing to remember. And Zohar is a
Often
very
can't be career orientated.
Correct. In other words, it cannot be. It's like when they say "Kol habereach min hakoved boreach acharov." When a person is tries to a person is runs away from
a covered loidef.
yeah covered reidef. So someone who runs away from honor and glory, the covet will pursue them. A person who runs after it, the covet will elude them. So the Rebbe would say sometimes that doesn't mean running away from the covet and looking over your shoulder if it's running after you. You know what it means? It means actually sincerely you don't want it at all. So there's some things that you only get when you're completely in the other mode. If you really want to, you need to first be a complete absorber and not with any strings attached. Exactly right. And actually covet is Malchus, by the way. Malchus is, you're not running to be honored. You're not, and I don't mean ego now. We're talking about even shlemus. I'm not doing this because I want to be more complete. Because I want to, because my teacher is so brilliant, I want to receive more from him. It's actually a real sense of utter emptiness, where you feel completely empty, and that is what absorbs. And I agree, Giluyim are a very different experience. This is experience of a nakuda, of a hell. Now, the next parentheses, which I'm going to do tomorrow, not today, is going to throw everybody for a loop. And if you think, just read the first line, you'll see what I mean. But we will get through it as well. Okay.
So it's a nakuda, but it's not a nakuda?
I said I'm not going to do it now because it needs to be learned properly. So we'll do that
Yeah,
tomorrow.
I know. That's why you're saying it's going to throw us.
Yeah. Well, he's going deeper. The Rebbe Rashab is dissecting this properly. You know. Okay, I'm going to stop here before this last parenthesis on page 1360. And we're getting there, right? We're getting there. Any other questions, comments, anything?
Today's
I have a question.
Today the Hayom Yom talks about Ayin Beis. Today the Hayom Yom. Interesting.
Right.
I have a question, but I think it's so stupid. I'm going to wait till you stop the recording.
It's your call. You want me to?
Well, yeah. I don't understand in the top, the bottom of the last page of 159, I guess it is. No, yeah, where it says the Zah is Nachaz Hazayin Tachtonos. So Zah are the 6 midos. And what is this? This 7 lower spheres, I guess, includes Zah and what? Malchus? I mean, I don't understand what that means. It's bound to itself. I mean, we're talking about 7 midos, I thought, of Atzilus, and then it's bound by the 7 lower spheres of what? Atzilus. It's bound by itself. And then it says the 6 midos are bound by the 7 tachtonos. I just don't understand what that means.
You know what the Gimel Rishonos and Zayin Tachtenis are in general?
Well, I joined the class later in the series, but the Gimel Rishonos
okay, so look, briefly, it goes like this. The 10 spheres, each sphere has all 10 spheres within them.
Right.
That's a given. The discussion here is not about that. The discussion here is about how these spheres emanated in the first place. So they emanated in stages. There's the root emanation of Zah, which is 6 midas, not Malchus, 6 midas, Chesed, Gvur, Tiferes, Netzach, Chayid, Yesod. So it emanated 6 facets. These 6 facets then additionally are given the Gimel Rishonos. Like he said, B'Shay Teisvis, that's an additional element that is add-on, like an additive, an accessory. is the three moichin, but initially it doesn't have moichin in it. That you
Okay.
understand?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, once you talk about the full entity of Zoh, so now we have the Gimel Rishenis, which were added on. He says that is in a state of Dveikus and Bittul. That's the absorber within Zoh now.
Mhm.
But Zoh also has the other spheres in them. The other
Mhm.
7 spheres, besides the first 3, which includes Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Chayd, and Yesod, Malchus. That's the Zayin Tachtenis, in contrast to the Gimel Rishenis.
I see.
And that's the primary function of Zoh. That's what means Nechas.
That's what makes it a mashpia, because it's bound to those lower spheres of itself, as opposed
Well,
to.
I wouldn't say lower
Gimel.
spheres of itself, that it's defined by these. Nechas means it's defined by these 7 in contrast to the top 3. If it was
Got
only
it.
Gimel Rishenis, then it would be just, you could say, a state of Bittul. But its definition, the structure of the Midas is really the Zayin Tachtenis. Now, Eliezer asked, if it's 6 facets, why is it 7 Midas within them? Because the fact is that all the spheres have all of them in them. But the real structure of Zoh is 6 facets. Within them are 7 emotions, 7 spheres, you can say, and 3 top ones.
Okay.
That's how I would put it.
Okay. I mean, I sort of inferred that, but you've helped me understand it better. I mean,
It's the
thank you.
structure. It's essentially the structure. Whereas Malchus doesn't have a structure like that. Malchus is just a point. Doesn't have anything to hold on to. There's no substance. Think of it like that. There's nothing. There's no substance.
There's no there.
Yeah. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll stop here. Top of